The call came in the middle of a quiet afternoon while I was finishing paperwork at my desk. I almost didn't answer because the number wasn't saved in my contacts. For a second, I assumed it was another spam call. Hello? There was a pause on the other end. I could hear wind and the distant hum of a lawnmower engine. Ma'am, I hope it's okay that I called you. The voice sounded familiar, but it took me a moment to place it. I'm the guy who cuts your lawn, Mike. Right, the lawn service. He came every other Thursday. Reliable, quiet, never caused problems. Yes, Mike, is everything okay? Another short pause, the kind that makes your stomach tighten before you even know why. Look, this is going to sound strange, he said carefully. I almost didn't call you. My pen stopped moving over the paper. Okay. I was mowing near the back of the house, he continued, lowering his voice, right by that basement window well. I already felt a small knot forming in my chest. And? I thought maybe there was a TV on down there or something, he said. But then I stopped the mower to listen. The office suddenly felt too quiet. What did you hear? I asked. He hesitated. Ma'am, I think there's a child crying in your basement. For a moment, I genuinely thought I had misheard him. What? I'm probably wrong, he said quickly. It might have been coming from another yard. Sound travels weird back there. I didn't answer immediately, because my daughter wasn't home. Emily had left 2 days earlier on a school science trip. 3 nights away. The bus left at 6 a.m, and I had watched it pull away from the parking lot myself, which meant there should be absolutely no child in my house. I'm sure it's nothing, Mike added nervously. I figured if it was my house, I'd want someone to tell me. I forced myself to breathe normally. You said you heard crying? Yeah, he said. Like a kid. Not loud, just upset. I stared at the stack of documents on my desk, but couldn't read a single word anymore. When exactly did you hear it? I asked. Maybe 20 minutes ago? And you're sure it came from the basement window? I was standing right next to it. Outside my office window, the late afternoon sun looked completely ordinary. Cars moved through the parking lot. A couple of coworkers were laughing near the entrance. Everything felt normal, except for the quiet, steady pressure building in the back of my mind. My basement. I tried to run through the facts logically. Emily was away. The house had been locked when I left that morning. No one else had a reason to be there. You don't hear it anymore? I asked. No, ma'am. It stopped after a minute or two. Did you see anyone? No. Another long pause stretched between us. Look, he said finally. I might be totally wrong. Maybe it came from the street or the neighbors. I just didn't want to ignore it. I rubbed my temple. No, I said slowly. You did the right thing calling. Are you close to the house? No, I'm at work. Do you want me to check around back again? The thought of someone wandering around my property made me uneasy. No, that's okay, I said. You've done enough. All right. He hesitated one last time. Sorry if I scared you. After we hung up, I sat completely still for several seconds. Then I opened the message thread and typed a short text. Which basement window exactly? 3 dots appeared almost immediately. A moment later, a photo came through. It was the narrow concrete window well behind the house, the small basement window half hidden by bushes. I stared at the picture, because something about it felt wrong. I couldn't immediately explain why, but the longer I looked at the metal frame around the glass, the more a quiet, uncomfortable thought started forming in my mind. And suddenly, the idea of my empty house sitting there alone felt very different. I told myself there was a simple explanation. There almost always was. Sound travels strangely between houses, especially in our neighborhood, where the yards backed into each other with very little space between fences. A kid 2 houses down crying near an open window could easily echo through the narrow corridor of backyards. That had to be it. Still, the photo Mike sent sat open on my phone screen while I packed up my things. The basement window looked the same as always. Small, rectangular, set deep into the concrete well behind the bushes. We almost never used it. The basement itself was mostly storage. Old boxes, holiday decorations, Emily's outgrown toys. There was no reason for anyone to be down there. And yet, as I stared at the picture, something bothered me. Not the window itself, the frame. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. I grabbed my keys and left the office earlier than I'd planned. The drive home usually took about 20 minutes, but that afternoon, every red light felt longer than usual. The whole time I kept replaying the conversation in my head. I think there's a child crying in your basement. It sounded ridiculous when I repeated it to myself, but Mike hadn't sounded like someone making a joke. He had sounded uneasy. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the house looked exactly the way it always did. Quiet. Still. The lawnmower tracks were visible in the grass where Mike had finished his work earlier. The backyard gate was closed. Nothing about the place suggested anything unusual had happened. I sat in the car for a moment before getting out. Then I walked to the front door and unlocked it. Inside, the air smelled faintly like the lemon cleaner I'd used that morning. The kitchen was exactly as I had left it. The living room couch still had the blanket folded neatly over the arm. I checked the hallway. Emily's bedroom door was closed. Her backpack from school sat against the wall where she had dropped it before leaving for the trip. Everything was normal. Still, the tight feeling in my chest hadn't disappeared. I moved through the house slowly, checking each room. Bathroom, guest room, laundry, empty. Finally, I stood at the top of the basement stairs. The door was closed. I reached for the handle and paused for a second, listening. Silence. Just the faint hum of the refrigerator upstairs. I opened the door. The basement smelled faintly of cool concrete and cardboard boxes, exactly the way it always had. I flipped on the overhead light and stepped down the stairs. Nothing moved. Shelves lined the far wall, stacked with plastic containers. The old treadmill sat folded in the corner. A row of labeled boxes filled the storage area near the back. Everything looked untouched. I walked across the floor slowly, scanning the space. If someone had been down here crying, there should have been some kind of sign. But there wasn't. I checked the small utility closet. Empty. The water heater hummed quietly in the corner. The window Mike had photographed sat low on the wall, just above ground level. Sunlight filtered faintly through the glass. I stepped closer. From inside, the frame looked perfectly normal. No cracks, no broken latch. I let out a quiet breath. Maybe he really had heard something from another yard. That explanation made the most sense. I turned away from the window and was about to head back upstairs when something caught my attention. The storage door. It sat near the back corner of the basement, leading to the small room where we kept older boxes and seasonal decorations. I walked toward it automatically, and then I stopped. Because the lock on the door looked different. For a second, I thought I was imagining it. but the longer I stared at the handle, the more certain I became. The lock wasn't the same one that had been there before. At first, I assumed my memory was wrong. The basement storage door wasn't something I paid much attention to. I opened it maybe 3 or 4 times a year, usually when it was time to pull out Christmas decorations or store away summer things. It would have been easy to forget what the lock looked like. Still, I stood there staring at the handle longer than necessary. The old one had been brass. I was almost certain of that. This one was darker, matte black, slightly heavier looking. I stepped closer. The metal was clean, almost new. No scratches around the screws, no small dents from years of use. It looked recently installed. A slow, uncomfortable feeling started moving through my chest because I hadn't replaced it, and I didn't remember asking anyone to replace it. I reached out and tested the handle. Locked. That wasn't unusual by itself. I usually kept it locked because Emily liked to wander through boxes when she was younger, and the room had a lot of old things stacked in unstable piles. But something about the lock itself bothered me. The keyhole was different. A different brand entirely. I leaned down slightly to look closer at the screws. They were bright silver, clean, untouched by dust, which meant they hadn't been sitting there for years. They had been installed recently. I straightened slowly and looked around the basement again. Nothing else had changed. The shelves were still packed with the same plastic bins. The treadmill was still folded in the corner. The small table near the water heater still held a box of light bulbs and a coil of extension cords. Everything else looked exactly the same. Only the lock had changed. I tried the handle again. Still locked. Okay, I muttered quietly to myself. Maybe I had replaced it and forgotten. That wasn't impossible. Between work, Emily's schedule, and everything else, the last few months had been busy. Still, I pulled my phone out of my pocket. I scrolled through my contacts until I found the number for the locksmith who had worked on the house earlier that year. Back in the spring, the front door lock had started sticking, and I'd had someone come out to fix it. I remembered the man clearly because he had been unusually careful with his work, the kind of person who explained every small detail before doing anything. If the basement lock had been replaced around that time, he would know. I pressed the call button. The phone rang twice before he answered. "Good afternoon, this is Harris Lock and Key." "Hi," I said. "You worked on my house a few months ago? Front door lock replacement." There was a brief pause while he searched his memory. "White House on Willow Ridge Drive?" "Yes." "Oh, yeah, I remember that one. The old deadbolt was worn out." "That's right. What can I help you with?" I glanced back at the basement storage door. "I just had a quick question," I said. "When you came out that day, did you replace any locks in the basement?" Silence. Then the man answered immediately. "No, ma'am." "You're sure?" "Positive. I only worked on the front door and adjusted the back sliding door latch. I never went into the basement." I felt the same quiet pressure returning to the back of my mind. "Okay," I said slowly. "Thank you." "No problem. If you need anything else, just give us a call." After we hung up, I stood there for several seconds without moving. The basement felt colder than it had a few minutes earlier, because now one small fact had become impossible to ignore. The storage door lock had been replaced, and I hadn't done it, which meant someone else had. I looked at the door again, then at the quiet basement around me, and for the first time since Mike's phone call, a much more uncomfortable possibility started forming in my head. Someone had been inside my house. I forced myself to stay calm. Jumping to conclusions never helped anyone. That was something I had learned years earlier in my job. When something didn't make sense, the first step wasn't panic, it was verification. There had to be a logical explanation. Maybe the lock had been replaced during some earlier repair and I had simply forgotten. Maybe my ex-husband had changed it during one of the weekends Emily spent with him. Maybe the house inspection when we refinanced last year had involved someone adjusting it. There were dozens of possibilities. Still, none of them explained why the lock looked brand new. I walked closer to the storage door again. The handle itself was solid and heavy. A keyed deadbolt sat above it, something that hadn't been there before. That part I knew for certain. We had never needed two locks on a storage room full of old holiday decorations. I touched the deadbolt. Locked. No key hung from the hook nearby where we usually kept spare basement keys. I stepped back again, scanning the room. Nothing else seemed disturbed. The dust on the top of the plastic bins looked untouched. The treadmill belt had the same thin layer of powdery dust it always collected. No footprints, no open boxes, nothing except the lock. My phone buzzed in my hand. It was Mike, a short message. Did everything look okay? I stared at the text for a moment before replying. Basement is empty. I didn't hear anything. 3 dots appeared again. Then another message arrived. That's good. I was worried I scared you for nothing. I typed back. You didn't. I appreciate the call. A few seconds passed. Then one more message appeared. Just so you know, the crying didn't sound like it was coming through the window. I frowned. What do you mean? His reply came almost immediately. It sounded like it was deeper in the basement, like behind a wall or something. I read the message twice. Behind a wall. My eyes drifted back toward the locked storage door. The room behind it sat against the far foundation wall of the house. No windows, no outside access, just a square space filled with stacked boxes. There was nowhere inside that room for anyone to hide. Still, the message sat on my screen like a quiet weight. Are you sure? I typed. This time, his reply took longer. I'm not 100% sure, but when I stopped the mower, it sounded muffled, like it was echoing inside. My throat felt slightly dry. Okay, I wrote back. Thanks again for telling me. The conversation ended there. I slipped the phone back into my pocket. For a few seconds, I simply stood in the middle of the basement, listening. Nothing. The house was completely silent. The logical part of my brain kept repeating the same argument. If someone were down here, I would know. There would be noise, movement, something. But another part of my mind kept returning to one detail. The crying Mike had heard had stopped after a minute or two, as if someone had quieted it. I looked at the storage door again, then at the deadbolt above the handle. If the key existed somewhere in the house, it was probably upstairs. But even as I started toward the staircase, another thought stopped me halfway. Because if someone had replaced that lock, they probably hadn't left the key sitting in my kitchen drawer. I went upstairs slowly, closing the basement door behind me. For a few minutes I stood in the kitchen, trying to think through the situation carefully. One strange lock didn't automatically mean someone had broken into the house. But it also wasn't something I could ignore. The first place I checked was the small drawer beside the refrigerator where we kept extra keys. Over the years, it had become the default place for anything that didn't have a better home, loose batteries, spare screws, a few old house keys from previous locks. I pulled the drawer open. A handful of keys lay inside. I picked them up one by one. Front door spare, garage side door, old mailbox key we no longer used. None of them matched the darker style of the basement deadbolt. I checked the small tray near the hallway table next. Nothing there either. Then I opened the cabinet where we kept the emergency lockbox key from when we first moved into the house. Still nothing. By the time I finished checking the obvious places, the same quiet conclusion kept repeating in my head. Whoever installed that lock had kept the key. I leaned against the kitchen counter and tried to think of anyone who might have had access to the house recently. Repair workers, family, friends. The list wasn't long. I lived a fairly quiet life. Most days it was just work, home, and Emily's schedule. A memory surfaced suddenly. 3 months earlier, my brother Daniel had stopped by while I was still at work. He had called beforehand saying he needed to drop off a birthday gift for Emily, but couldn't make it in the evening. At the time, I had given him the garage code so he could leave the package inside. He had only been in the house for about 10 minutes. At least, that's what he told me. I pushed the thought aside immediately. Daniel wouldn't secretly install a lock in my basement. That was ridiculous. Still, the question remained. Someone had. And they had done it without telling me. I walked back toward the basement door. For a moment, I just stood there looking at the handle. The house felt unusually quiet without Emily around. Normally, there would be music playing from her room, or the sound of her moving around upstairs. Tonight, there was nothing, just silence. I opened the basement door again and went back down. The storage door sat exactly where I had left it. Black handle, new deadbolt, locked. I stood in front of it for a long moment. Then I made a simple decision. If someone had changed the lock, I was going to open it. I went to the small tool cabinet near the workbench and pulled out a flathead screwdriver. It wasn't the right tool for the job, but it might be enough to loosen the screws. I knelt beside the door and placed the tip against the first screw on the deadbolt plate. The metal resisted at first. Then it began to turn slowly. The quiet scrape of metal against metal echoed through the basement. One screw came loose, then another. The deadbolt plate shifted slightly as the last screw began to turn. I paused for a moment before removing it completely, because the closer I got to opening that door, the more a strange feeling crept in. A mixture of curiosity and something heavier, something closer to dread. Finally, the last screw came free. The deadbolt plate dropped into my hand. I stood up slowly and gripped the handle. For a second, I just listened. The basement remained silent. Then I turned the handle and pushed the door open. The storage room light was still on. That was the first thing I noticed. I didn't remember leaving it that way. Normally, the room stayed dark unless I was actively digging through boxes. The switch was just inside the door, and I always flipped it off when I left. But now the yellow overhead bulb was already glowing. I stood in the doorway for a second, letting my eyes adjust. The room looked almost exactly the same as it always had. Plastic bins stacked along the left wall. Old cardboard boxes on metal shelving. A narrow path through the middle, just wide enough to walk. Nothing appeared disturbed. Still, something about the air inside the room felt different, stale, as if the space had been closed for too long. I stepped inside slowly. The concrete floor felt cooler here than in the main basement. I moved past the first row of bins and looked around carefully. No one was there. No child. No sign of anyone hiding between the shelves. Just the same clutter we had accumulated over the years. I exhaled quietly. Maybe this really was nothing. Maybe someone had replaced the lock months ago, and I simply hadn't noticed. Maybe Mike had heard a neighbor's kid through the yard, and everything had just lined up in a strange way. I turned toward the back wall where the older boxes were stacked. That's when I saw the mattress. It sat low on the floor near the far corner. A thin, twin mattress, partially hidden behind two plastic bins. For a moment, my brain refused to process what I was looking at. Because there was absolutely no reason for a mattress to be in this room. We didn't store furniture here. Emily had never owned a mattress that small, and it definitely hadn't been there the last time I opened the door. I walked closer. The mattress wasn't old. It looked recently placed there. A folded gray blanket sat on top of it. Next to the mattress, a half-empty plastic water bottle rested against the wall. My stomach tightened. I looked around the room again. Suddenly, the space didn't feel like a storage room anymore. It felt arranged, used. I crouched slowly beside the mattress. The blanket was warm, not hot, but warm enough that someone had been there recently. A cold wave moved through my chest. I stood up quickly and scanned the rest of the room again. That's when I noticed the small plastic container near the shelf. Inside were a few snack wrappers, granola bars, a small juice box, things a child would eat. The same quiet thought returned, louder now. Someone had been living down here. And if Mike had heard crying earlier that afternoon, then whoever it was might not be gone yet. I turned slowly toward the doorway, and for the first time since entering the basement, I realized something else. The door behind me was no longer fully open. It had shifted slightly, just enough that the edge of it now blocked part of the light from the basement, as if someone had touched it from the other side. For a second, I didn't move. My brain tried to decide whether the door had actually moved, or whether I had simply pushed it that way without noticing. It was possible. The hinges were old. The basement floor wasn't perfectly level. Doors sometimes shifted slightly when left half open. Still, I stared at the narrow gap where the light from the main basement spilled through. The opening looked smaller than before. Quietly, I stepped closer. The room remained completely silent. No breathing, no movement, nothing. When I reached the doorway, I pushed the door open again. The main basement was exactly as I had left it. The shelves stood against the wall. The treadmill sat in the corner. The staircase leading upstairs remained empty. No one was there. I stepped out of the storage room and turned in a slow circle. My heart had started beating faster now, though I tried not to show it even to myself, because the evidence inside that room was impossible to ignore. Someone had been staying there. The mattress, the food wrappers, the water bottle, and if the blanket had still been warm, then whoever had used it hadn't left very long ago. I walked back into the main basement and listened carefully. The house above remained quiet. No footsteps, no doors closing, No sound of anyone moving upstairs. Still, something about the situation felt wrong. If someone had been hiding in my basement storage room, they would have needed a way to enter the house without being seen. But the doors upstairs had been locked when I arrived. The windows were all closed. There was no obvious entry point. Unless they had been inside before I came home. That thought sat heavily in my mind, because if it was true, then the person could still be somewhere in the house. I turned toward the basement stairs and climbed halfway up. From there, I could see into the kitchen, still empty. The sunlight through the back window had started fading toward evening. Everything looked normal. But normal didn't explain the mattress downstairs. I went back down the steps slowly. My phone buzzed again. Another message from Mike. "Sorry to bother you again," it read. But when I was loading the mower earlier, I noticed something else. I typed back immediately. "What?" A few seconds passed. Then his reply appeared. "The gate in your backyard was unlocked." My eyes moved toward the small basement window near the floor, the one he had photographed earlier. From inside the basement, I could see the metal frame clearly. The latch was slightly raised, not wide open, but not fully locked either. I walked over and crouched down beside it. The dirt outside the window well looked disturbed. Fresh footprints marked the soil. Small ones. Child-sized. My chest tightened, because suddenly Mike's words from earlier returned to me with uncomfortable clarity. It sounded like it was deeper in the basement. I slowly stood up again. And that's when I heard it. Very faint. So quiet, I almost convinced myself it was imagination. But it came again a second later. A small, muffled sound. Not from upstairs, not from outside. From somewhere behind me. From inside the basement. A soft, shaky breath, followed by the quietest sound of someone trying not to cry. Every muscle in my body locked. For 1 second, I thought the sound had come from inside my own chest. That would have been easier. Easier than standing alone in my basement, knowing my daughter was out of town, knowing the storage room held a warm blanket and child-sized footprints, and knowing I had just heard a child somewhere inside my house trying not to make noise. "Hello?" I said. My voice came out thinner than I wanted. Silence. Then another sound. Not a full sob, more like someone swallowing one. It came from the far side of the basement, not the stairs, not the storage room behind me. The wall. I turned slowly. The sound had come from behind the old metal shelving unit near the water heater, the one holding paint cans, extension cords, and bins of camping gear Emily never used. I took one careful step toward it. "Hello," I said again, quieter this time. "I'm not going to hurt you." No answer. But I knew I hadn't imagined it. Once you hear something like that in a silent room, your body knows before your mind catches up. I crouched and looked past the bottom shelf. That was when I noticed the gap. Not large, maybe 3 inches between the back of the shelf and the wall, enough to show the unit wasn't flush against the concrete the way it should have been. It had been pulled forward. I stood up, slowly. The shelf was heavy, but not immovable. If someone wanted to hide something behind it, they could. My phone was still in my hand. I called 911. The dispatcher answered immediately. "My name is Claire Mercer," I said. "I'm at my house. My daughter is away, and I think there may be a child hidden in my basement." Her tone changed at once. "Are you in immediate danger?" "I don't know." "Can you see anyone?" "No." "Can you hear anyone?" "Yes, very faintly." "Leave the basement now." I looked at the shelf. "I think they're behind the wall." "Ma'am, officers are on the way. Leave the basement and wait outside if you can do so safely." That was sensible. It was also impossible. If there was a child behind that wall, I couldn't walk out and hope whoever put them there didn't come back first. "I'm staying where I am," I said, "but I'm not going closer. Do not approach anyone if you see them." I ended the call and switched on my flashlight. The beam cut across the shelf, the water heater, the wall. Then it caught something else. A seam. It ran vertically behind the shelf, narrow but visible once I knew where to look. Not part of the poured concrete. Not original. A panel line disguised with paint and shadow. My mouth went dry. The shelf wasn't hiding storage. It was hiding a door. A shaking breath came again, louder this time. Then a whisper. Not words, just the sound of a child trying to breathe quietly enough not to be found. "I hear you," I said, keeping my voice low. "You're okay. Police are coming." For the first time, there was movement from the other side. A scrape, then a tiny thud, like someone shifting against wood. I moved to the side of the shelf carefully. The seam line was clearer now. Someone had painted over the edges to make it blend into the wall. At shoulder height, half hidden by the shelf upright, was a recessed handle. I stared at it. Because a hidden door in my basement should have been impossible. And yet there it was. Someone had built or altered a concealed space inside my house. I heard tires outside then, fast, one vehicle and then another. Good. But before relief could settle, another thought hit me hard enough to make me step back from the wall. If there was a child behind that hidden door, then someone had put them there on purpose. And whoever did it had known my daughter was away. That thought stayed with me even after I heard the police car doors slam outside. The hidden room was terrifying on its own. A concealed space behind a false wall in my basement. A child breathing on the other side of it. But the timing made it worse. Emily's school trip had been scheduled for weeks. Anyone close enough to know our routine would know the house would be quieter while she was gone. Someone had planned around that. The first officer came through the back door after I shouted that I was in the basement. Another followed seconds later. Both had flashlights out. Their movements were quick but controlled. "Ma'am, step toward the stairs," the taller one said. "There's a child behind that wall," I said immediately. "I heard crying." He looked at the shelving unit, then at the thin seam in the wall. "Stay back," he said. I moved toward the bottom step while they approached the shelf. One officer pulled the metal rack away from the wall, revealing the narrow panel more clearly. Up close, it looked even less like part of the house, and more like something built later. The taller officer tried the recessed handle. Locked. "Key?" he asked without turning. "No." "Anyone else in the house?" "No." "Anyone with access to the property?" Yes, I said quietly. Family. He nodded but didn't ask more. Instead, he stepped back and drove his shoulder into the panel. It didn't open. He hit it again. The frame cracked. On the third impact, the latch gave, and the door swung inward. A stale smell pushed out into the basement air. Then I heard it clearly. A child crying. Not loud, just exhausted. There's a girl in here, the officer said. Relief and shock hit me at the same time. The younger officer crouched down and spoke into the hidden space. Hey, you're safe. We're police. I could only see part of the room from where I stood. It was small, barely deeper than a closet. A thin mattress lay on the floor, 2 plastic water bottles beside it, and a little girl sitting against the back wall. She looked around 8 years old, not someone I knew, not anyone who belonged in my house. The officer helped her out slowly. She was pale and trembling. By the time she stepped into the open basement, the paramedics had already arrived. They wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. What's your name? One medic asked gently. Mia, she whispered. Okay, Mia, you're safe now. The girl nodded weakly but kept crying. I stood near the stairs, my hand covering my mouth. The taller officer turned toward me. Ma'am, we need to talk upstairs. I followed him into the kitchen. Another officer was already there taking notes. He asked the basic questions first. My name, my daughter's name, whether any other children should have been in the house, whether I knew the girl in the basement. No, no, no. Each answer made the situation feel more unreal. Then he asked the question that mattered most. Who besides you has access to this house? I stared at the kitchen table for a moment, because the list was short, very short, and suddenly the entire situation stopped feeling random. Hidden rooms don't appear overnight. Locks don't replace themselves. Children don't end up behind basement walls by accident. Someone had used my house, and whoever it was had known exactly when it would be empty. That thought sat in my chest while the officers continued moving through the basement. One of them was still near the hidden room, speaking quietly with the paramedics. The little girl, Mia, sat wrapped in a gray blanket on the bottom step of the basement stairs. A medic was kneeling in front of her, speaking gently while checking her pulse. You're safe now, the medic kept repeating. The girl nodded slightly but kept her eyes on the floor. I stood several feet away, trying to process what had just happened inside my own house. The taller officer walked back toward me. Ma'am, he said calmly, I need to ask you a few questions. Of course. Who besides you has access to this house? The question came exactly the way I knew it would, because there were only a few possible answers. My brother has been here before, I said slowly. My ex-husband used to come by sometimes when Emily forgot things for school. Anyone else with keys? No. Garage codes, alarm codes. My brother had the garage code once, I admitted. When? About 3 months ago. He stopped by to drop something off. The officer nodded slightly. Did he go into the basement? He said he didn't. The officer wrote something down in a small notebook. Anyone else who might know your daughter was away? Family, I said. A few parents from school, maybe. The officer glanced toward the basement again. The room behind that wall wasn't built overnight, he said. I know. It required materials, tools, Time inside the house. I nodded slowly, because that part had already begun forming in my head. Someone had worked down here, possibly more than once, possibly while I was at work, possibly while Emily was upstairs in her room. A new thought hit me suddenly. There was a delivery, I said. The officer looked up. What kind of delivery? A long box. Hardware, I think. When? About 2 weeks ago. And it was addressed to you? No, I said. I could see the label clearly again in my mind now. It had my address, but a different name. What name? I hesitated for half a second. Then I said it. My brother, Daniel. The officer didn't react immediately. He just wrote the name down. What happened to the package? I called him, I said. He told me it was a shipping mistake and that he'd pick it up later. Did he? No. Where is it now? I pointed toward the storage room. In the basement. The officer looked toward the door we had opened earlier. Then he nodded once. All right, he said. Let's take a look at it. And for the first time since the police arrived, I felt something worse than confusion settling in. Because the situation downstairs had stopped looking like a random crime. It was starting to look like preparation. And the name on that box meant the person who prepared it might not be a stranger. The officer walked toward the storage room, and I followed a few steps behind him. The other officers had finished checking the hidden space behind the wall. One of them was photographing the inside, while another collected the bottles and wrappers from the floor. The shelf had been pulled completely away from the wall now. From where I stood, the hidden doorway was impossible to miss. It looked crude up close. Metal brackets holding the frame in place, fresh screws in the wood, uneven paint where someone had tried to blend the panel into the concrete wall. It hadn't been built years ago. It had been built recently. The officer stepped into the storage room and looked around. Where exactly is the package? I pointed toward the back corner. Behind those bins. He moved the plastic containers aside and crouched down. The box was still there, long and narrow, about the length of a small tool case. The shipping label had been partially torn when I first picked it up 2 weeks earlier, but the name and address were still readable. The officer tilted it toward the light. Daniel Mercer, he read. My stomach tightened. That's my brother. The officer nodded once and pulled a small knife from his pocket. He sliced carefully through the tape along the top seam. The cardboard opened with a soft ripping sound. Inside were several pieces of metal hardware wrapped in brown packing paper. He lifted one of them out. It was a thick steel hinge plate. Another officer stepped closer and looked at it. That matches the panel frame, he said. The first officer nodded and reached back into the box. This time, he pulled out a compact, battery-powered drill and a set of screws still sealed in plastic. Tools, not random tools, installation tools. The exact kind you would use to build something like the hidden door in the basement wall. I felt suddenly cold because the pieces fit together too easily. The delivery, the lock change, the hidden room, all of it connected through one simple fact. The package had arrived at my house, under my brother's name. The officer closed the box again and stood up. When was the last time you spoke with Daniel? He asked. 2 days ago. What did you talk about? Emily's school trip? The officer exchanged a glance with the other one. Did he know your daughter would be away? Yes. Silence settled briefly in the basement, because that detail mattered. A lot. The hidden room hadn't existed for years. It had been built recently enough that the hardware delivery was still sitting unopened in the storage room. Recently enough that the mattress inside the hidden space still held warmth. Recently enough that the girl had been left there only hours before the lawn worker heard her crying. The officer looked back at me. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "we're going to need to speak with your brother." And suddenly, the entire situation shifted again, because until that moment, Daniel had only been a possibility in my mind. Now, he had become the first real suspect. The word itself felt strange in my head. Suspect. Daniel wasn't someone I normally associated with police investigations or hidden rooms behind basement walls. He was my older brother, the person who had taught me how to ride a bike when we were kids, the person who still called Emily every year on her birthday. The officer seemed to notice the hesitation on my face. "We're not accusing anyone yet," he said calmly. "We're just following the evidence." I nodded, though the explanation didn't make the situation feel any easier. Behind us, the paramedics were preparing to take Mia to the ambulance. One of them gently helped her to her feet. The girl looked exhausted, her small hands gripping the blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Before they led her toward the back door, she glanced once toward the basement wall, toward the hidden room. Then her eyes shifted to me. For a second, I thought she might say something. Instead, she looked away again. The officer beside me spoke quietly into his radio. "Dispatch, we'll need a unit to locate Daniel Mercer. Possible connection to unlawful confinement." The words echoed in the basement. Possible connection. Unlawful confinement. I leaned against the railing near the stairs. How long had she been down there? I asked. The officer answered carefully. Hard to say exactly, but based on the supplies we found, probably more than one day. My chest tightened. She said her name was Mia, I said. Yes. Did she say anything else? Not yet. She's scared. That made sense. If a child had been hidden inside a wall for days, fear would probably feel like the only stable thing left. The officer looked back toward the storage room. Your basement shows signs of recent construction, he said. New brackets, new screws, fresh cuts in the wood frame. I nodded slowly. I never heard anything. You were at work during the day? Yes. And your daughter? School. The officer's expression remained neutral. That would have given someone several hours at a time. Several hours. Enough time to move shelves. Enough time to install hinges. Enough time to build a hidden door. The realization settled slowly but heavily. Someone had been working in my basement while I lived upstairs. The officer picked up the hardware box again and looked at the shipping label. This was delivered 2 weeks ago? Yes. And your brother never came back for it? No. Another officer joined us near the bottom of the stairs. Ambulance is leaving, he said. The girl's stable. That was the first piece of good news all night. The taller officer nodded. Good. Then he looked back at me. Do you know where your brother is right now? I'm not sure, I said. He lives across town. Does he have a key to your house? No. But he knew the garage code. Yes. The officer wrote something else in his notebook. Then he closed it. Ma'am, we're going to check on him tonight. The basement suddenly felt colder again. Because the situation was moving from suspicion towards something much more real. If Daniel had ordered the hardware, if Daniel had access to the house, then the next question was unavoidable. Had my brother built the place where that little girl had been hiding? The question stayed in my head even after the police cars left the driveway. 2 officers remained inside the house, collecting photographs and measurements from the basement. Another team had taken Mia to the hospital. The ambulance lights had disappeared down the street 10 minutes earlier, but the quiet they left behind felt heavier than the noise. I sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water I hadn't touched. The taller officer eventually came back upstairs. "We've sent a unit to your brother's address," he said. My stomach tightened. "Is he there?" "We don't know yet." He sat across from me, resting his notebook on the table. "I need to ask you a few more things." "Okay." "Has Daniel ever had problems with the law?" "No." "Financial problems?" I hesitated. "Some," I admitted. "Nothing serious that I know of. He changed jobs last year." "What kind of work does he do now?" "Logistics, warehouse management." The officer wrote it down. "Has he ever brought anyone unusual around your family?" "What do you mean?" "Friends you didn't know, new relationships, anyone connected to children or childcare." The question sounded strange until I remembered Mia, the girl sitting inside the hidden room. "No," I said slowly. "Not that I remember." The officer nodded and closed the notebook again. "We'll know more once we speak with him." The words were calm, but the meaning behind them wasn't. Speak with him. Not call him, not ask him. Speak with him. Which meant the police already believed there was enough evidence to treat him seriously. I stared at the kitchen floor. "Do you think he did it?" The officer didn't answer immediately. "We don't make conclusions that quickly," he said. "But the hardware was delivered here under his name." "Yes." "And someone had to build that wall." "Yes." "And someone had to bring that girl into my house." "Yes." The officer folded his hands together on the table. "All of those things are true." A patrol radio crackled faintly from the officer standing near the living room doorway. The taller officer looked up immediately. The other officer lifted the radio to his mouth, listened for a moment, then looked back toward us. "They found him." The words made my chest tighten. "Where?" the taller officer asked. "At his apartment." "Is he cooperating?" The officer hesitated. "Not exactly." Silence filled the kitchen, because in that moment, the entire situation shifted again. Until now, Daniel had only been a possibility. But if the police were already having trouble with him, then the next part of the night wasn't going to be about speculation anymore. It was going to be about answers. And whatever those answers were, they were about to change the way I saw my own family. The officer stood up slowly when the radio call ended. "Ma'am, we're going to head over there," he said. "Another unit is already at your brother's apartment." My throat felt dry. "Did they say what's happening?" "Not yet." "Is he being arrested?" The officer didn't answer directly. "We need to talk to him first," which meant the situation was already serious. 2 officers gathered their equipment from the kitchen counter. One of them zipped the evidence bag containing the hardware pieces they had taken from the basement. The house suddenly felt enormous and empty again, a place that just a few hours earlier, had felt safe. Now, every room seemed unfamiliar. "Should I stay here?" I asked. "For now, yes," the officer said. "We may need you available if we have more questions tonight." I nodded. "Okay." He paused near the door. "If anything comes back to you, anything unusual your brother might have said recently, write it down." "I will." A moment later, the police cars were pulling away from the curb again. Their headlights disappeared down the street, leaving the house in quiet darkness. For the first time since the call from the lawn worker, I was alone. I walked slowly back toward the basement door. The officers had left the lights on downstairs. The shelf still stood pulled away from the wall. The hidden door remained open. From the top of the stairs, I could see the narrow space behind the false panel where Mia had been sitting only an hour earlier. The mattress was still there. So were the empty bottles. Evidence markers now sat beside them. The room looked smaller than I remembered. Smaller and colder. I turned away and walked back into the kitchen. My phone lay on the table where I had set it earlier. For a moment, I considered calling Daniel. But if the police were already speaking with him, the call wouldn't go through anyway. Instead, I sat down and tried to think. 2 weeks ago, a hardware box had arrived under his name. Someone had replaced the basement lock. Someone had built a hidden room. And tonight, a child had been found inside it. I looked at the clock on the kitchen wall. 9:47 p.m. It felt impossible that only a few hours earlier, my biggest concern had been finishing paperwork at work before picking Emily up from the bus on Friday. Now everything felt different. The phone buzzed suddenly against the table. I grabbed it immediately. Unknown number. For a second, I thought it might be the police. I answered. "Hello?" There was breathing on the other end. Then a voice I recognized instantly. "Claire." "Daniel." My stomach dropped. "Where are you?" I asked. There was a pause. Then he said something that made the entire situation shift again. "I think someone set me up." For a second, I didn't say anything. Daniel's voice sounded different than usual. Not panicked, not angry, just tight, like someone trying very carefully to control what they said next. "Daniel," I said slowly, "the police just left my house." "I know." That made my stomach drop even further. "You know?" "They came to my apartment," he said. "I'm not there." The words landed heavily. "You're not there?" I repeated. "No." "Then where are you?" Another pause. "I can't tell you that right now." "Daniel," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "There was a little girl in a hidden room in my basement." Silence filled the line. I could hear him breathing. "I know," he said quietly. The kitchen suddenly felt much colder. "You know?" "Yes." My hand tightened around the phone. "Did you build that room?" "No." "Your name was on the hardware delivery." "I didn't order it." "The police found tools in the box." "I know." "You know?" I repeated. "Yes." I stood up from the kitchen chair. "Daniel, stop saying that and explain what's happening." He exhaled slowly on the other end of the line. "I didn't build the room," he said again, "but I know who did." My heart started beating harder. "Then tell me." "It's not safe to talk about that over the phone." "Not safe for who?" "For you." The words sat in the air between us. "Daniel," I said, my voice tightening now. There was a child locked behind a wall in my house. I know, he said again. And you expect me to just wait while you speak in riddles? No. Then explain. Another long silence followed. When he finally spoke again, his voice was lower. Did the police tell you how long she'd been there? No. Did they tell you how the room was built? They found hardware in a box with your name on it. That box was supposed to come to my warehouse, he said. Not your house. I frowned. What? I ordered equipment 2 weeks ago, he continued. Door brackets, hinges, lock hardware. For what? For a storage unit renovation at work. Then why was it delivered to my address? That's the part I don't understand. The explanation sounded thin. Too thin. Daniel, I said slowly, the police think you built that room. I know. And you're running from them. I'm not running. You just said you left your apartment. Because someone followed me tonight. The words landed like a stone. Followed you? Yes. My chest tightened again. Who? I don't know. You don't know? No, but I think they're connected to the girl. I leaned against the kitchen counter, because suddenly the situation felt even bigger than it had 10 minutes earlier. What are you saying? I asked. That whoever put that child in your basement wanted someone else to take the blame. And that someone is you. Yes. The room felt silent again. Because if Daniel was telling the truth, then the person who built that hidden room hadn't just used my house. They had also used my brother. I stood in the kitchen holding the phone, trying to decide whether I believed him. Daniel, I said slowly, the police already found the hardware box. Your name is on it. I know. They're going to assume you ordered it. I did order it, he said. Just not for your house. The explanation still felt thin. Then explain how the box ended up here. I'm trying to figure that out, he said. But something else happened tonight. What? I went back to the warehouse after my shift. And? The storage unit I was supposed to renovate was already open. My grip on the phone tightened. Open? Yes. Maybe someone else started the work. That's what I thought at first, he said, until I looked inside. What did you see? Nothing. The words sounded strange. What do you mean, nothing? I mean the tools were gone. The brackets were gone. Everything I ordered. A quiet realization moved through my chest. The same hardware the police just found in my basement. Yes. And you didn't take it? No. Then who did? That's what I'm trying to tell you. His voice dropped lower. Someone had access to the warehouse. Your coworkers? Maybe. But you said someone followed you. Yes. When? After I left work. I pressed my hand against the kitchen counter. Daniel, start from the beginning. He exhaled slowly. I finished my shift around 6. I stayed late because I wanted to start measuring the storage unit for the renovation. That's when I realized the door was already unlocked. And the equipment was missing. Yes. What did you do? I called the supervisor. And? He said no one else had authorization to move the tools. The kitchen felt colder again. Then what? I left. That's it? No. His voice tightened. When I got into the parking lot, there was a car sitting near the exit. What kind of car? Dark sedan, no headlights. And? It pulled out behind me when I drove away. A small chill ran through my shoulders. You think they were following you? Yes. Did they keep following you? For 3 blocks. Then what happened? I turned onto the highway. And they stopped? Yes. Silence filled the line. Because the timing of everything was beginning to line up too neatly. The tools disappeared from Daniel's warehouse. The same tools appeared in a box delivered to my house. A hidden room was built in my basement, and a child was placed inside it. Daniel, I said carefully, if someone wanted to frame you, yes, they'd need a reason. I know. And they'd need access to my house. Yes. The realization formed slowly, because the list of people who could connect both places was extremely small. Daniel, I said quietly, who else knew about that storage unit renovation? He hesitated. Just one other person. My stomach tightened. Who? My supervisor. The kitchen suddenly felt much smaller, because if his supervisor had access to the tools and knew Daniel's name, then the person who built the hidden room might not be a stranger after all. Daniel, I said slowly, what's your supervisor's name? There was a pause on the line. Rick Palmer. Have you told the police any of this? No. Why not? Because they think I'm the one who built that room, he said. If I start talking about missing tools and someone following me, it's going to sound like I'm making excuses. He wasn't entirely wrong. The police had a box of hardware with his name on it. They had a hidden room in my basement built with the same kind of brackets and hinges that had disappeared from his warehouse. From their point of view, the story probably looked very simple. But something about the situation still didn't fit. Daniel, I said, does Rick know where I live? Yes. My chest tightened. How? You hosted Emily's birthday party here last year, remember? A few of us from work stopped by when I dropped off the cake. I did remember. A small group of his co-workers had come over for about 20 minutes, just long enough to say hello before heading back to work. Was Rick there? Yes. That detail settled heavily in my mind. Did he go inside the house? Yes. And the basement? I don't know, Daniel said. Why? Because someone replaced the lock down there. Silence followed. Then Daniel spoke again. Claire, did the police find anything else? Like what? Cameras? No. Another pause. Then whoever did this expected to come back. My stomach dropped. Come back? Yes. For what? For the girl. The words hung in the air between us. Daniel, the police already took her to the hospital. I know. How? Because the police went to my apartment before you called me. Right. They had already been looking for him. Daniel, I said carefully, where are you right now? He hesitated again. Parking lot across from your street. My heart skipped. You're near my house? Yes. Why? Because I wanted to make sure you were safe. I looked toward the front window of the kitchen, Outside, the streetlights had come on. The quiet suburban road looked exactly the same as it always did. "Daniel," I said quietly, "if someone used your name to build that room and used my house to hide that girl." "Yes." "Then they knew both of us." "Yes." "And they expected the police to come looking for you." "Yes." The logic formed slowly but clearly. Someone had tried to place the blame on Daniel, which meant they needed him to look guilty. And if the girl had stayed hidden in my basement much longer, then eventually someone would have discovered her. And the first name connected to the construction materials would have been my brother's. "Claire," Daniel said. "Yes?" "I think Rick planned this." "Why?" "Because he asked me something strange yesterday." "What?" "He asked if your house had a basement." My hand tightened around the phone. "What did you say?" I told him yes. The kitchen suddenly felt much colder, because if Rick Palmer knew my house had a basement and knew Daniel had access to it, then the hidden room behind my wall might have been built by someone who had visited my home before. "Daniel," I said quietly, "why would your supervisor want to frame you?" "I don't know yet," he admitted. "But you think he did?" "Yes, because of the tools, and because of something else." "What?" "The girl." I leaned against the kitchen counter. "What about her?" "She didn't just appear in your basement," he said. "Someone had to move her there." "I know that. And whoever did it needed a place where she could stay hidden for at least a few days." "Yes." "Somewhere no one would look." The answer was obvious. A hidden room behind a basement wall. "Claire," Daniel continued, "did the police say how the girl looked?" "What do you mean? Was she injured?" "No," I said, "just scared." "Did she say who brought her there?" "No." Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that made the situation shift again. "Rick has a daughter." I froze. "How old?" 8. The same age as the girl in my basement. My mind immediately rejected the idea. "You think that was his daughter?" "I'm not sure," Daniel said, "but the timing is strange. Why would someone hide their own child?" "To accuse someone else of kidnapping." The logic hit me immediately. If a child were discovered hidden in my basement, and the materials used to build the room were ordered under Daniel's name, then it would look exactly like Daniel had kidnapped her, and my house would be the place he used to hide the evidence. "Daniel," I said slowly, "that would destroy your life." "Yes." "And mine." "Yes." Why would he do that? Another long pause followed. When Daniel spoke again, his voice sounded heavier. "Because I reported him last month." My stomach tightened. "For what?" "Inventory fraud." The kitchen suddenly felt very quiet. "How serious?" "Serious enough that the company started an investigation." "And Rick knew you reported him?" "Yes." "And if you were arrested for kidnapping, the investigation would disappear," Daniel finished. The entire picture snapped together with frightening clarity. Someone steals construction materials, builds a hidden room in my basement, uses Daniel's name on the shipment, hides a child there, waits for the discovery. And suddenly, Daniel becomes the obvious suspect. "Daniel," I said, "where is Rick now?" "I don't know." But if the girl in my basement was really his daughter, yes, then he's going to realize the plan failed. Silence filled the phone, because that meant something else, too. If Rick Palmer had been desperate enough to frame my brother for kidnapping, then the night might not be over yet. Daniel, I said quietly, if Rick realizes the girl is already with the police, yes, he might try to disappear. Or he might try to fix the situation. My stomach tightened. What does that mean? It means he might try to control the story before the police do. I walked slowly toward the front window. The street outside still looked calm. A few houses down, someone's porch light flickered on as the timer switched over for the night. Nothing about the neighborhood suggested that an investigation had just started inside my house. Daniel, I said, where exactly are you? Across the street from your block? You shouldn't be here. I know. Then why are you? Because if Rick realizes the police already found the girl, he might come back. Back where? To the place he left her. My chest tightened again. My house. Yes. The logic made a disturbing amount of sense. If Rick had expected the girl to stay hidden for longer, then he might still believe she was inside the basement. And if he came back tonight, he wouldn't know the police had already taken her away. Daniel, I said, you need to leave. I will, he said, in a minute. Daniel, I just want to make sure no one comes near the house. As if the night had been waiting for that exact moment, headlights appeared at the end of the street. A dark sedan rolled slowly past the corner. My breath caught immediately. Daniel. What? There's a car. What kind? Dark. Silence on the phone. Then Daniel spoke quietly. That's the same car that followed me. The sedan slowed as it passed my driveway. For a second, the headlights swept across the front of the house, lighting up the living room windows. Then the car stopped, right at the curb. My heart started beating harder. Daniel, I whispered. The car just parked. Stay inside, he said immediately. What are you doing? I'm coming to the house. No, I said quickly. The police told me to stay here. They also think I'm a suspect, he said. The driver's side door of the sedan opened. Someone stepped out. From the kitchen window, I could only see the outline of a tall man walking toward the sidewalk. Daniel, I whispered, someone's getting out of the car. Go upstairs, he said. Now. The man outside started moving toward my driveway, and for the first time that night, the situation was no longer about hidden rooms or missing hardware. It was about whoever had just arrived at my house. Daniel, I whispered, he's walking toward the driveway. Go upstairs, he repeated. I'm not leaving the phone. Take it with you. I moved quickly through the kitchen, my eyes still fixed on the window. The man outside stepped fully into the light from the street lamp. Even from inside the house, I could see enough to recognize the face. Daniel, I said slowly, I think it's him. Rick? Yes. He stopped near the front walkway and looked toward the house like he was checking if any lights were on. The living room lamp was still glowing through the curtains. Claire, Daniel said quietly, listen to me carefully. I'm listening. Do not open the door. I won't. I'm already coming across the street. What? I'm not letting him walk into that house. Daniel, the police told you. I know what they told me. Outside, Rick moved closer to the porch. He looked around once more, then reached toward the doorbell. Before he could press it, headlights suddenly flooded the entire street. 2 police vehicles turned the corner at the same time. Blue lights exploded across the quiet block. Rick froze. The front doorbell camera caught the moment perfectly as he turned toward the flashing lights. Within seconds, both police cars stopped beside the curb. Officers stepped out immediately. "Sir," one of them called sharply, "step away from the house." Rick raised his hands halfway, the expression on his face shifting from surprise to something colder. "I live nearby," he said. "Then you won't mind explaining why you're standing on this property," the officer replied. I could hear everything through the doorbell speaker connected to my phone. Another officer walked up beside him. "Rick Palmer?" the second officer asked. Rick hesitated. That was all the answer they needed. "Sir, we're going to need you to come with us." Rick looked toward the house one last time. For a moment, our eyes met through the narrow glass beside the front door. And in that second, I understood something clearly. He had expected the girl to still be hidden in my basement. He had come back to make sure the story unfolded the way he planned. But the police had already taken her, and now the entire plan was collapsing. "Claire," Daniel said quietly through the phone, "the officers just told me they found Rick's daughter listed as missing earlier today." My chest loosened for the first time all night. Outside, the officers guided Rick toward the patrol car. The investigation would take time. There would be reports, statements, and weeks of legal work ahead. But the hidden room was already documented. The materials were already traced, and the girl was already safe. The story Rick tried to build inside my basement had fallen apart before it even began. And this time, the truth had arrived faster than his plan.